So we're back. So I hope some of what Kathy Trower was talking about is going to stick with you. I know it's going to stick with me. I could tell because I had to use the facilities just before I came up here, and all I could think about was that red dot. Wow, I heard that. All right, so last year at the Fall Forum, we shared some findings from theater facts that illustrated the challenge that many theaters are having with working capital. Our most recent edition of Theater Facts showed a remarkable recovery in earned income since the shock of 2009. That's been led in large part by the recovery of the stock market and a diversification of earned income streams. However, that rise in earned income still has not offset significant cash flow challenges with working capital, the unrestricted resources available to meet day-to-day obligations and cash needs, significantly negative in each of the past 5 years. At the same time, 39% of our Trend theaters were in a capital campaign in 2013, the highest level of the past 5 years. These campaigns range from raising funds for facilities and equipment to endowments to securing artistic or programming funds. So theaters are seizing opportunities at the same time as they're facing significant challenges. These challenges and opportunities were why we asked Susan Nelson of TDC and Rebecca Thomas of the Nonprofit Finance Fund to talk about capitalization last year. And it's why we've asked Susan back to go even deeper and help us identify our critical capitalization challenge. Susan Nelson is a principal at Technical Development Corporation and the author of the seminal capitalization study, Getting Beyond Break-Even. Please join me in welcoming Susan Nelson to the stage.
I appreciate you wanting to talk about money right after lunch, when it's usually sleepy time. So we'll try to make it a little more exciting. So I want to start with the argument that your culture determines your cash. And that actually cash and culture is a really good phrase. And so that's what my next hour is going to be about. How do we think about your culture influencing your cash? So, let's see, am I going to hold it up if I turned it on? And it would still go. There we go. Okay. So over the last 5 years, we've been going around the country talking about the fact that everybody and their brother is undercapitalized in the nonprofit sector. And that, not surprisingly, it hurts. And I think we've gotten a lot of traction in 2 areas. Organizational leadership constantly tells us we're right. Yes, it's terrible, we have no money. And, surprisingly, or in a good set of good news, foundation funders are starting to have that same conversation. And we're starting to have conversations with foundation funders that say, do we contribute to that fact? Do we help or hurt in that situation? So we see lots of traction around the country with leadership of organizations, and we see lots of traction with funders from foundations. It's unclear to us, however, if we're getting traction in 2 other areas. One is at the board level. So while an executive director, managing director, artistic director can tell us, I feel the pain of no cash, it hurts me every day, a board member might say, they're getting along fine, we made payroll. Different points of view. Individual donors will say, I gave them enough to close the gap. I have to give it to someone else. Didn't I stretch enough? I don't want giving them to get a surplus. What? I gave them enough. So it's not clear we've made the case in a really compelling way with our own boards and with our individual donors. So our closest stakeholders, conversation isn't going as well. Why is that? I think what we have to be able to understand is all capitalization is not equal. We've spent a lot of time talking to you all about how one size doesn't fit all. Everybody's challenges are different, everybody's models are different, how you would capitalize is different. And so you can't come at it with a cookie cutter way. You have to start and understand what your way is. And so understanding your specific challenge is critical because it's how you're going to communicate why it matters. You have to as we talked about this morning, defining the problem is 90% of this issue. So that you can communicate it very directly to the board and to your major donors. So that's what we think the next step of this conversation is about. So what are we going to do today? We're going to look at how you define your strategy, how you define your strategy, how you define your business model, and how you define your risk profile. Because as somebody said this morning so well, your work is all about risk, and being really explicit about what your risk profile is going to be critical here. And then who owns the responsibility for meeting this challenge? Who owns it? What part of your culture needs to change in order to own this piece? So that's what we're going to talk about today. No talk is good without some definitions. So what are we really talking about? So my definition of capitalization is as simple as it can be. It's having the cash to do what you want to do when you want to do it. I wish it was something else, but that's really it. Do you have cash that belongs to you that allows you to do the things you need to do when you need to do them? Not 6 weeks from now, not 6 months from now, not when the opportunity is past, right now, when you do it. It connects your mission, your visions, and your strategy. It's the glue that holds it all together. It is about the ability to invest in your art, and it allows you to take risks. So that's the core definition of capitalization. Okay. So this is usually where somebody wants us, and I think last year we had some of us talk about this, wants us to put up a slide that says, well, how much cash should I have in each of my buckets of cash that I need? And can we all go home and have a drink now? And we can't do that. So how do you determine what kind of capital you need? You have to start with looking at your overall mission and vision, the market you sit in, your core business drivers, in order to create an integrated strategy that talks about program operations and the underlying capitalization. People often call us and say, can we have a capitalization plan? And I say, no. If you did a strategic plan, business plan right, it has a capitalization component in it. If it doesn't, we need to go back and do your plan again. There's no such thing as a capitalization plan that sits on the side. You can't divorce money from mission and strategy. It has to be an integrated whole. So, it starts here. Then we have to think about what that means for your business model. We're going to talk a lot today about business models because they're different. I know we're all in search of the Nirvana business model, and we're sure somebody's got it. And when they get it, they're going to put up their hand and tell you. That's not how it works. A business model is how your organization specifically makes and spends money. And it's influenced by all the things we talked about in the slide before. Vision and strategy, your local market, your time horizon, how long are you in the business for, where you are in your life cycle, are you starting, are you reinventing, are you getting up off your knees, are you on a forward momentum, are you growing? All those things influence. And it thinks a lot about what is surrounding you and what puts you down and ties you in to being inflexible. Organizations that start to have major commitments become less and less flexible in their business model and require more and more capital. What does that mean? Simply put, if you have a building, you're stuck. It's not an asset, it's a liability. It requires huge amounts of cash, and it's non-negotiable. When the bathroom doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. The more commitments you make to organizational components, the less flexible you are, the more capital you need. So that's a big idea in a business model. So, and what does it comprise? It comprises your revenue mix. Kevin just told you earned revenues are changing for you. That's great. What is that mix? How predictable and reliable are they? How your expenses are composed, and how reliable you can quote those to surplus. Those are all the components of a business model. So let's put that in the back of our minds as we go along. Here's the next big thing we have to remember. We talk about this with funders a ton. Revenue and capital are two completely different things. Revenue is the money you use every year to do the things you're going to do. You consume it up. You get it in, you spend it out. Capital is what sits on your balance sheet. You can get it in two ways. People give it to you to infuse directly on your balance sheet, only if you're in a surplus. Otherwise, you aid it in your loss. Or you post it yourself and you build your own capital through the surplus. But they're different. Sometimes people give you money that acts as, you think are acting as capital. They're giving you working capital, they think, or they're giving you money to do something new, change capital. We'll talk about these different types. But really what they end up getting sucked into is your operating loss, because you don't have enough revenue. Revenue comes first, capital comes second. Okay, so they're different, and we'll talk about that. Okay, this is the next piece that I think we want to spend a lot of time thinking about today. Risk is the thing we all want to talk about. When we first started going around and talking about this, artistic directors loved my initial stump speech, because what did everybody want? Artistic risk fund. And they thought, yeah, if we agree with her, we'll get one of those. But risk is actually complicated. And how we have to think about risk on an organizational level comes in two parts. One is risk management, and the other is risk taking. So let's talk about risk management first. Risk management is the thing that you have to determine in your own profile as to how much risk the very thing you do year in and year out has. So you might have a dedication to doing all new works. Unknown, no names, and no stars. You might have a high risk profile on an operating basis. The very season you put on an operating basis has more risk than some other organization might have. You have to figure out how much risk you really have and then manage to it. You also have to figure out how much risk you have on the human capital side. Are you leader dependent? You have to understand how leader dependent you are. If your leader would leave and the product would not be able to go on the stage, or you'd have such a loss of momentum, or you're so invested in the sweat equity of that leader, you have to reserve against that too. You have to understand the risk of that to your organization. So that's the risk management side. Risk taking is something completely different. Risk taking says, I have a new idea, artistically, programmatically, operationally, a business model idea, where I think I want to do something major, and I either want to test it, or I want to do it. But it's risk taking. And understanding what a risk is on that side is completely different. One of the things we argue with folks about that we think is really interesting, if you do a risk management profile of your organization, if you figure out how much you are risking every year, the example we always use is, most leaders can tell you where their revenue numbers are off in their annual budget, where they're feeling squishy. If I look around under my watch, people, yeah. So you all know the squish. Say it was you're $1 million organization, it's $100,000 that you think is squishy, 10%. If you had a risk profile, what you would say around risk management, am I willing to risk my $100,000 that is sitting in my own cash? As a board, as an organization, are we willing to risk together? If you had a complete understanding of what your risk management profile was, you'd have a different discussion at the board level about how risky your budget was and what you all need to do together. And what you would discuss is not that $100,000 and who didn't deliver it at the end of the budget, but at the beginning of the budget, you might say, this is a collective risk that we agree that we've interrogated together, and we're going to take it. Because there's a way it's going to move our art forward, the way it's going to move our organization forward. It's being very transparent about risk. So we're going to talk about these ideas all the way. Okay, those are the basic definitions of what we're going to talk about. Now let's talk about types of capital. If you're part of the people I know in Boston, you're so sick of this slide. You can cry. Okay, this reinforces the big idea here. There's only one way to get capital onto your balance sheet: net income. Builds net assets. Again, I wish there was some other magic. This is it. Looking for anything else? Nothing to be had. This is it. Posting surpluses. Builds assets. When you're capitalizing, your net assets have to be broken out in a way that is totally hierarchical. Working capital is the first thing you all need. You have to pay your bills. Operating reserves are the things that help you in a rainy day. Risk capital is stuff that if you set it aside, you can take that risk we were talking about. Facilities reserves is the stuff that helps make you a little more flexible in an inflexible world with a building. Endowment for certain large organizations smooths the way. Not everybody should have endowment. We can talk about that later. So this is highly hierarchical. If you don't have any working capital, if you have negative net assets, you have no working capital, nor reserves. I don't care if you sliced it out and you're temporarily reserved or permanently reserved, you stole money from the other parts of the buckets. This is hierarchical. Everything gets sucked up to the top because you have to pay for payroll. So those are the types of capital. Working capital always trumps everything else. Okay? And this is what these different funds do. Working capital mitigates everyday risk. Operating reserves protects you from an unexpected downturn and manages your risk profile. So that's where you think, if I have bumpy seasons, and they're normally naturally bumpy, I should size a reserve to help me with the bumps. And that's normal. Facility reserves is what helps you with your building. Opportunity risk capital is one-time big risks or support. And endowment is longevity. One word about endowment. Endowment has to be large enough to be invested well to beat inflation and actually contribute to the bottom line. Everywhere we go, we find locked up endowments. People who have less than $5, $6, $7, $10 million, not beating inflation, losing money, inappropriately tied up when they don't have actual cash or working capital. If you're going to go down the endowment path, make sure it's big enough to actually make an effect and that you can actually get some money above and beyond the return you're going to get. Little bits of money don't get invested well. They get churned in the market or you get CD rates. They don't give you any return. You have to think long and hard about why you want an endowment. And an endowment, permanently restricted, is a 100-year commitment. You're said to a donor, I will be here for the next 100 years. So you better be sure you are. Because it's a different kind of commitment. Okay. Some folks need what we call traditional capital funds, transitional capital funds, money to fix the past and seed the future. We're in a bad place, we need to get out. We need to clear the decks. We have too much debt, we have no cash, we need to clear the decks. And then once we clear the decks, we need to do something different because we got here for a reason. We need to do something different, we need some money to help us do that. These kinds of capital usually come from the very closest people you know. These are the people who love you and think that you need another chance, or that you should go at one more time, or that they believe in your leadership, and therefore they want to help you move forward. And these kinds of capital are very important. Okay. When I looked at everybody's responses, one of the things that I heard everybody talk about was debt. What is that? What is debt good? So debt is a form of capital. But you've got to be really careful to make sure it's actually helpful capital. So where is debt great? Line of credit that can be paid back, that you're really using it, not as substitute financing, but it's really just cash flow. So rather than raising extra money on your balance sheet that can tie up as working capital, you can use other people's money, pay a low interest rate, and use it when you need it. That's great. Short-term financing of pledges to build a building when it has a very high ratio and you get a really low rate and you want to have momentum to move your project forward, it's also great. As long as you have perhaps 90% or better of pledges to debt. All our research shows if you drop below that 90%, for every 10 percentage points you drop, the pain increases fivefold. So, 90% or better, short-term financing, bond financing, high ratio of pledges, good. In a handful of cases, long-term financing with a very low cost, or midterm financing with a very low cost, there are a handful of organizations that actually can pay it out of their operations. They can pay principal and interest out of their annual operations, and it doesn't affect them. I've met 5. It does happen. I'm not going to lie and say it doesn't, but they're few and far between. And it really requires you to understand, can you pay principal and interest out of your operating budget without cutting everything else? If you actually put those numbers in your budget and still post a surplus. So that's kind of the rule of road about kind of capital for debt. Okay, everybody kind of get the toys we're playing with today? Okay, so the question that we wanted to ask today was, can we diagnose your challenge? So we always have to start about where is your organization today. We use 4 broad categories. Are you at risk? Are you vulnerable? Can you sustain yourself, or are you stable? At risk means you have no cash and high debt. That means one good external push, and you have to stop. It may not go away, but you have to slow down profoundly and do something different. Vulnerable means you may not have the debt that is weighing you down, but you don't have any cash. You can make do, you kind of bump along, but really, you're waiting for that envelope to come in with that check. You're thinking, I can get to the post office, and it'll be there. Or you're calling your donor and saying, can you advance the gift? Sustaining means, you're moving it along. You've got some cash in there. If something wildly horrible happens, you still have to go to outside sources to help you, but you could kind of withstand the bumps for a few months. Get it together. And stable means, you could take an external shock and you could probably take the year to figure it out. You could take real time to figure it out. So those are the 4 kind of broad buckets we use. There's no magic to them, but it kind of gives you a place to start. So you need to think first, where am I in these buckets? And one of the things we looked at is we pulled out Kevin's theater facts. And so we looked at this and said, that's not good. So when we looked at this, what we saw is the groups who answered, on average, have all their assets tied up in fixed assets. And they're upside down on working capital, which is a nice way of saying broke. Wow. When we unpacked this, we looked at your theater facts. 62% of people lived in the bad place, and 48% lived in a better place. 38%, sorry. So that's pretty high. That means a lot of you are in the no cash zone. This doesn't tell us if you have debt, but this tells us that you're in the no cash zone. And this told us you're trying to get better against it. This was like, are we progressing against our expenses? I can see there's some light here. Some folks are doing a little bit better, but not everybody. So the surpluses you would need to kind of start to make this feel better, they're a little bit suddenly good, but it's still not happening at the rate that you probably need to take off on that working capital challenge. You guys don't look anything different than every data sample set I've looked at across the country. So this is actually not indicative of just theaters. This is indicative of art and culture organizations writ large. So it has something to do with the way we are performing as nonprofits, as well as where you are in the theater world. There are very specific challenges that you all need to address in order to address this, but it is happening everywhere. So these don't look much different, and the percentages don't look much different. Okay. So here's the next piece. If we think about it, what kind of capitalization challenge you have, where you start, the first question we have to ask is it a capitalization issue, or is it a failure of your business model? You can't capitalize out of a bad business model. You can only capitalize a working business model. So what we're going to do for the rest of the time together is we're going to talk about what some of the scenarios you might be thinking about capitalizing when you have a working business model, how you would know it, what you might do, what you might attack first. And then we're going to talk about what if it's not a working business model. Where should you attack that first? How should you think about that differently? Yep.
Are you talking about the business model of the field or the business model of the individual
Of the
organization?
individual organization. I don't believe in the business model of the field. I just don't believe in that. I think there are things that you all share, but how all politics are local, all business models are local. Okay? All right. So here's what we're going to talk about. People who are thinking about how to move from being an at-risk organization to sustaining. They have an improving operating model, business model. They have negative unrestricted net assets. They're bouncing around between break-even or deficit, and they have no cash in some debt. That's the first group. The second group is moving from vulnerable to sustaining. They too have an improving operating model, business model. Their unrestricted net assets, theirs is kind of flat. Maybe a little negative, a little positive, but it's basically flat. Bouncing around between break-even and better, and they have a little bit of cash. Then people who are truly undercapitalized. You have a working operating model. Your balance sheet's just thin. You have a decent amount of earnings, that's right, but you're truly undercapitalized. You don't have a facilities reserve, you don't have a risk fund, you haven't been able to set aside the artistic dollars, you haven't been able to figure out the risk profile and get it quite right. You haven't figured out the bigger picture. Then we're going to talk about organizations who are considering growth. Notice the things I'm going to put underneath here. They have a stable operating model to start. They have a healthy balance sheet, regular surpluses, and are already capitalized to their size. And then people who have a broken business model. Negative unrestricted assets, structural deficits, and negative cash, which is possible. Okay? Okay, so moving from at-risk to sustaining. We did two different big studies. One is the Getting Beyond Break-Even study, where we went in 2009 and looked at organizations in Philadelphia, 150 organizations. And then we went back in 2013 and looked at the same data set over an 8-year period and looked at them through a trend line idea, and we looked at them through an individual organization idea about what is really happening. What we looked at was moving from one category to the next, because we had all this long data set. It was hard. And organizations who were sitting in the at-risk pile struggled to make investments in programming, marketing, and fundraising. What we found is that all their investments were erratic, and they couldn't sustain them. So if you looked at them over an 8-year period, things went up and down and up and down, and up and down and up and down and up and down. So there was no consistent through line for how people were investing in any of the buckets that might move your organization ahead. Those that did make a change had some form of recovery capital. Somebody helped them clean up the negative part. So people who actually made a change got their hands on some recovery capital. So that's what the research tells us. How do you know if you're in this bucket and you're ready to move forward? and actually you move from being at risk to kind of starting to be capitalized well. Your current business model has the ability to do better than break even. It might not have matured into it right now, but you know that you can see it happening. Your sales are getting a little bit better, your donors are getting better, you have a trajectory, you've been testing it, you understand it, your results are getting a little more predictable. You feel that your operating model is getting better and will continue to get better. You have gotten really clear on where your risks are and what you're going to capitalize to. And most importantly, you have a really good understanding of demand. That means you understand what is possible with not only your audience, but your donor base. You actually understand how high the demand is in both those audiences. So you've been able to say that my model works and it's getting better because I understand where the room is to grow, both in earned and unearned. I get it, I can see it, I can name it, I know where it's going. So, what type of capital should you consider when you're in this place? This is the hardest message I'm going to give all day. Everybody wants to jump to change capital or to working capital or risk capital immediately. I'm here to tell you if you don't clean up your negative net assets, all that money just goes away and makes your donors furious. Because you can't use it to do anything but patch the holes. You absolutely cannot do it. This is the hardest thing for a board and a donor to understand. You have to clean up the negative net assets. People will say, but we're making it right now. Well, wait. Well, usually you're making it because you're maxed out on your credit lines, your debt is out to the wazoo, you've spent next year's season's money the day it came in, and your bills are out 120 days. So the idea you're getting a deal with your vendors or you're working well with your artists is not working. So you have to clean it up first. That's the first thing you do before you can work on any other capitalization. I think this is critical to understand about how you want to move forward. If you have unrestricted negative net assets, you have to clean them up before you can capitalize anything else. And you should only clean them up with your people who love you if you know your model is going to work. Otherwise, you're just kind of cleaning up to no end. So that's the dollars you should work here first. Okay, how about if you have a little bit of cash? This is much harder for boards. You've got a little bit of cash. Right? It feels, no, it's not good. And you know it's not good. If you're the leader of the organization, you know what trade-offs you're making with the product and with the art. And you know what trade-offs you're making with the programming. And you know how you're not advancing people or paying them well. You know all this. And how much sweat equity is in your system. You know all those things. But the board thinks, you got $10. What's the problem? This is really hard, but it's really important. Because what we saw in all the data is organizations that made a goal of posting surpluses and moving here did it. They did it. Took them 3 or 4 years, but they did it. They said yes. They said yes at the board level. They said yes at the staff level. They did the things they needed to do in order to make that happen, which was they had a model that could do break even or better. They understood their risk profile and they understood the demand. Same things as last time. These things are critical. They knew those things were happening. They committed to the model. They committed to moving forward. That meant, usually, the board had to stretch what they're giving. The board had to help other parts of the organization stretch what they're giving. Leadership had to make sure they were as cost efficient as possible. People sometimes had to give up sacred cow programs. But they got it if they move forward. So what kind of capital would you consider here? Here's where you think, well, and I need to bring up my working capital first. If you have positive unrestricted net assets, here's where a letter, some kind of line of credit might work great. Operating reserves are now something you should really be working on. And if you have a facility reserve. I skipped over something I should have told you. Way back, if you're moving from at-risk to sustaining, if you're in that terrible place with negative net assets, you should be very careful, and you have debt, you should be very careful before you pay it back. I don't encourage you to pay back debt first unless you're being demanded to pay it back, and it's going to hurt you. At this moment in your life, you need all the cash you can get your hands on, and actually paying back low-cost debt might not help you. So I know there's often a moment where boards want to run and clean up the debt first, but you have to think about that really carefully at this moment, because you're trying to conserve as much cash as possible and move forward. Okay, but when you're in this place where you have a little cash and you're starting to build it up, you could start, and you have some debt that's long-term. You might think about starting to pay that off in a different way. If the cost is too high, if you can't make enough in the money that you're actually investing, then you should think about paying it off. But again, once you're in the debt situation, and if it's low-cost debt, we might tell you, as you're building your capital back up, that might be the last place you go. Unless you have external demands, where the bank or the bondholders or the letter of credit is supported is making you do things with your business that are not tolerable, then you have to think about moving it. So, okay. What about if you're undercapitalized? So there's hardly anybody who sits here. This is a minority part of organizations. Everybody thinks this is where they are, but really most people are not here yet. If you thought boards found it hard with the last group, this group people think, I just don't care. I'm not gonna, your model is working, you have little bits of surpluses, you're giving people raises every year. You want money in reserves? Are you crazy? This is the hardest one to really make the case for, right? This is the one. However, again, research is on your side here. Organizations that have created these appropriate funds, such as operating and artistic risk, we can demonstrate they have benefited both organizationally and artistically. What's really interesting about these funds is that people don't often spend them, but they increase their risk. You understand what I'm saying? They take more risk with their art and with new products because there's money sitting there. They very rarely use it because it's not covering up deficits, it's not covering up a bad business model. It's actually supposed to be doing the thing you want to do, which is hedging risk. And so people actually think long and hard before they're going to use it. They make really good decisions about risk, and they very rarely spend it. It is liberating all by itself. So we used to say to people, for example, an artistic risk fund should be some multiple of a show, or it should be the half of a cost of a show, or it should be the delta on 3 shows that you want to do between what a full house would do and a half house. You can think of a lot of different things about a reserve. So we now say to people, do that, and then half it, because you don't need as much money as you think you need in these reserves. If you have a working operating model, and you're taking real risk against a real sense of what a risk profile is, just simply having the money changes your behavior in a really good way. So, how would you know if you're ready to do this? Your business model is working. You generally have annual surpluses. That doesn't mean every once in a while you're not going to have a loss, because everybody does. And everybody should. Do you have a clear and agreed upon definition of both operational and artistic risk? And do you have a clear and agreed upon way how to communicate how capital will increase impact? Here's the other thing about people who try to capitalize, and I think we get guilty of this too, because we go out and say, capitalize, 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 go ask funders for money. If you go and ask somebody for an operating reserve or artistic reserve, they're going to tell you, what? No. We don't do that. You just just talk about the artistic impact you're going to have, how you're going to move your organization ahead, what are the things you are promising for output on the artistic organizational program side, and then you say it's going to cost X, I need a grant of X, Y, or Z, or I need an investment of X, Y, or Z. Completely different conversation. So I think we've not helped you all set up the right conversations. Going and asking for an outright set of reserve funds, not going to help you. Talking about why your organization is moving the dial, putting out the art that you want to put out, recognizing the artistic director's vision, increasing audience engagement, all that good stuff, that sells. And so understanding how to communicate it is really important. Okay, so now is when you can look at the whole panoply of capital and say, let's do it. And so should you pay down debt? Again, I'm going to say, if you can pay, if it's low cost money and you have investments that are making more, there's a word for that I can't use on the stage. I don't know if I would do it. If it's costing you, then you should think about starting to pay it down. Should you use debt? Absolutely. Well-considered lines of credit have the same liberating factor as a risk reserve. You set up a line of credit that you actually can pay back, it helps you. Organizations that are really stable, they never use their $1 million, $500,000 credit line, but when we talk to people, it helps them again with risk. They feel better. We're not going to use it, we still have it, we'll take a higher risk. So again, having a line of credit, psychologically helpful, and a better use of cash when you need it. Okay? All right. So what if you're considering growing? What kind of capital do you need then? So lots of people decide to grow when they're broke. I know what my problem is. I'm not big enough. I'm not attracting the major donors. I need a building to get noticed. I'm not a big enough player in my community. I know why Mrs. Gotrocks isn't giving me any money. I need to be a $10 million organization. Then I'll get a $100,000 gift. Okay. So here's what data tells us. Organizations that don't start from strength, when they grow, don't get stronger, they get weaker. Period. We looked at 25 organizations recently that were in a capital campaign. So many of you are in a capital campaign, I'm speaking directly to you. Of those 25, 20 did not address their core broken balance sheet. They had no working capital to start with. They had no reserves for a facility. If they were an endowment-based organization, they were already under-endowed. Their campaigns did not address those critical core issues, nor did they rescale, naturally, because they didn't do what would be working capital and reserves and facilities reserves for the bigger organization. What did they get? 7, 8 years later, a bigger hole, a much bigger hole, a more inflexible hole, debt they can't move out of, and consistently laid off staff and diminished programming. You can't grow your way out of it. So we've been looking at this a lot, we're going to talk about scale a little bit later. I think in this field what we've done is because we don't have agreed upon measurements about impact and intrinsic value, we substitute growth as the common measurement. We're good if we grow, because we've got nothing else we can agree on. And so we all strive to grow because that'll prove how good we are. And yet all the metrics tell us, this is dicey stuff. So when do we think you should consider growth? Not when you're broken, but when you're stable. When you're stable, is when you need to grow. Because the other thing that we found in our most recent study was of all the organizations who grew, and we interviewed them all, only 2 out of 60 grew because there was demand. Everybody else grew hoping they would create demand. If you build it, they will come. It's not a strategy. So that's a really big finding. Only 2 grew because there was demand. Those organizations are doing fine. Everybody else is in a tough place. So, are you ready to grow? Do you have a solid donor base? Do you have a working balance sheet? Which means you have the ability to repay your credit lines, and we actually have cash on it. Growth, because we just said, may not fix this weak operating model. We scaling or right sizing might. And do you have a data-driven growth plan? Do you know there's demand on both the audience side and the donor side? You know it. You see it. If you do that, then what you would think about from a capitalization standpoint for capitalizing growth is boosting up your working capital and reserves, getting yourself some change capital, money that you're going to consume while you grow. Somebody here last year talked about their story about how their theaters changed and grew, and actually they knew that it was going to take them some time to catch up. They knew the demand was there, but they knew it would take them some time to catch up with the audience growth and catch up with the donor growth. They had to invest a little bit up front. That's change capital. You need it up front to kind of put it into your system to actually help you. It's like substitute revenue, change capital. The other thing about growth is sweat equity. So for organizations that are smaller, the other study that we just finished was a huge study about organizations under $1 million and how much they're dependent on sweat equity. I know you're not surprised, I was stunned. I always thought sweat equity was a big deal. Sweat equity is like the deal. It is the deal under $1 million. Organizations are run on sweat equity. 3 guys, 3 girls, and a crazy board member. So here's the big finding. Sweat equity is not scalable. Unless you're going to find 3 crazy board members, and 12 people are going to work for nothing, which you can't do. When you grow and you're smaller, you have to really think, what does it take to substitute for the sweat equity? Because here's the other finding. When you pay one person above and beyond what the sweat equity group is getting paid, because you're going to use those people to propel you forward, other people stop working. Because they think they're getting paid. Different conversation. Sweat equity is not scalable. If you want to grow, first you have to figure out what it would take to substitute your sweat equity first, then grow. It's a double burden. So $1 million organization is more likely than not to cost $1.5 million. So to get to $2 million, you have to think about another million. 100% growth, not 50% growth. I have to really think about it. Sweat equity. Walk away with nothing else is not scalable. Should you use long-term debt? As I said before, only to bridge pledges. And should you use short-term debt? Sure, for working lines of credit payments. So those are the pieces that we would think about for growth. Okay. I think my battery's dying. Yeah, it definitely is dying. Okay. All right, so here's the other piece. Lots of people have tried to capitalize in the last few years and have not been successful. And lots of funders we have spoken to around the country have started operating reserve programs, investments in working capital programs, facilities reserve programs, and they're in it for 2 or 3 years, and they say to me and other people in our field, this doesn't work. The money's gone. They gave me money and it's all gone. 2 years in and it's gone. Wasn't it supposed to be reserved? And it's because people didn't step back and actually say, is this organization ready to be capitalized the way we talked about? Is their model workable enough to be capitalized? Sometimes your model is just broken. It's just broken. It needs to be fixed. I talked to you about risk-taking and risk management. We're all good about risk, but really what the field is full of is risk avoidance. Because the biggest risk of all is a broken business model. And we don't want to confront it. So here's where you have to step back and say, is my model broken? And here's how you might know. You have consistent losses over a multi-year period. That doesn't mean you're not breaking even year in and year out. Here's what I mean by that. There are a lot of pink light things that can happen to make your year look better. Mrs. Gottrock's died. Putting that money away for a rainy day. She gave you basically 5 years of her gifts in one big lump sum, and rather than spreading them out over 5 years so it was better, you took it all in 1 year and you covered your deficit. 3 people who are seniors stopped working because they got other jobs. You thought, I'll hold my breath and I won't fill those jobs for the rest of the year. I'll break even. There's all sorts of ways that we make a year break even that is actually not about an operating model that works. God bless you all for doing it. It's what makes you great managers. It doesn't make you good business model managers. It makes you good yearly managers. You're covering up the pain. You need to open it up and look and say, is my model actually working? Here's the other thing that you would tell, why you'd be able to tell. Yeah, you broke even, but to do it, you had to take a performance out. You had to consistently scale back on what you knew what the marketing dollar should be. You traded out that artist for this artist. You made a deal with the venue not to pay them till next year. There's all sorts of things that you can do that if you're constantly doing them against a rational budget, here's a perfect example. I went into an organization the last couple months ago. They told me they had a $5 million budget. And that's because they had a $5 million budget. When I looked at what their budgets had been for the last 7 years, they had been between 5.7 and $6.2 million. When I looked at what they were trying to spend it on, it was all rational. It was rational. It would be what you would do to get that organization moving. They never made it beyond 5, which means within the first 3 months they were scrambling to do something else. Which means once you get to that place, you cannot implement strategy. All you can do is get to the next performance and make the payroll. You cannot implement strategy. So that's how you might know, thank you very much, that your business model is broken. The other way you would know is that you have an inability to invest in your staff. If your payroll has been frozen for more than 3 years, your business model is broken, period. If you can't keep up with escalating costs that are normally naturally escalating, you can't give people 2%, 1% raises, your business model is broken. You will not have the long-term talent you need to actually do the work you need to do, nor will you be able to pay people a fair and equitable wage. These things are actually all indications of whether or not your model is broken. Do you need all of them? You probably, if you have one, you probably have the others. Or you have them at different times. So what does that really mean? It means you have to go back to the beginning and retest your vision and mission. Somebody said it this morning, it all starts with the artist and the art. You gotta go back there. You can't futz around the edges. How do we best present, produce, provide a platform for the art? How do we do that? And then once we figure that out, then how do we capitalize it? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that. We call it scaling to the market. And what does that mean? scale of an organization is determined by market relevance. Market relevance is a really tricky idea. Market relevance means there is a group of people who care about what you do from both the audience and donor perspective, and that you are engaging them. We call it in our shop, in an ugly way, who cares who pays? Who cares who pays? When you're out of whack, it's because your ambitions are greater than the amount of people who care or who will pay. Again, I wish it was more simple than that, something more complicated, but really that's it. Market relevance can mean a whole bunch of different things though. We've been going around the country asking people about who's doing great work in audience development. And we've heard back, you're going to tell me this much better than I'm going to tell you, community engagement, how do we talk to our communities, how do we engage our audiences is changing in a really rapid way. It's not just older versus younger, it's how we're talking, how we're inviting people in. What does it mean to have you diverse and inclusive? All those things that you talked about this morning, market relevance. How are we in conversation with our communities? So market relevance tells you if your business model works and it affects your strategy. And here's how it's tested. It's the ability to increase net revenue. Gross revenue is no measure. Everybody wants to say, I can grow my fundraising by $200,000. If it costs you $150,000, the net revenue is what matters. Well, that's really what matters. And so we're going to talk about what the difference is between earned revenue and the cost of marketing it, and unearned revenue through fundraising, and what those ideas might be. Okay, so here's the biggest thing everybody tells you. More marketing, more people. Right? More marketing, more people. Let's unpack that lesson. So we did this study of 150 organizations in Philadelphia as I just said, over an 8-year period. We looked at average marketing spend by budget size. Now there's a lot of other things we could talk about discipline and all that good stuff, but it all plays out the same way. Average marketing spend. You could double $10,000 to cows come home, and you're not going to step out of your niche. It's just the way the world is. You could remind people to come more often. You could remind the people who you already care about to come more often. You can get them top of mind. You can get the people you already know to give you more, do more with you. Stepping outside of the people you know for $20,000, not going to happen. Yep.
Is this inclusive of human resources, money, payroll, etc.?
Yep. Yep. He asked if it was inclusive of staff. It's staff and buys. Right? What can you staff do? What can you buy? You have to really understand what a marketing buy can do and what it can't do. What social media can do and what it can't do. And you have to understand, can it just deepen your recognition amongst your niche, which is a great goal, wonderful goal. Or can it actually expand your audience? And that has everything to do, unfortunately, with how much money you can spend. And so math is at play here. You have to think long and hard about how to use these resources. Because unless you can get to drive time radio, playing 5 times a week, you're not going to get outside your niche. So you got to talk about that. And you've got to talk about how much money you could spend against that niche and still make net revenue. So if you hire a marketing director for $50,000, they better be able to give you at least $60,000 in revenue. You've got to do that math. That only means, though, you got 10 grand. You have to think really hard. So if you were going to spend $50,000 on a new marketing person, then you probably need to spend another $50,000 to $75,000 on the attendance stuff. Let's say that got you $150,000. To make it worthwhile, you better have $300,000 worth of revenue that you think you can make it. Yep.
It's like a 6-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, you got to just, right. Right? You have to think about the reality here. Okay. larger spends in our sector are under threat. When we looked at this longitudinal data on the larger ends of the spends, let's say from 200,000 up to 3 million, what we found is people's marketing budgets did this. What that implies is a sales, not a marketing approach. I'm investing in a show, and I'm selling the show. I am not selling the organization and keeping my brand at top of mind in a really crowded marketplace. That used to be great when I sold subscriptions all the time, all the time, all the time. But now that I'm selling less and I'm doing more single tickets, I gotta be top of mind all the time. Brand really matters. You have to have multi-channels to spend money on. So understanding what the ratio here is again for net revenue is really important. So what does that imply? When you're stepping back and thinking about your business model, when you're thinking about how to scale, every organization needs to think about what is there based on their mission, their size, their market potential, and their strategy. What are you chasing with marketing dollars? Stability. I'm trying to keep the same audience I got. Hard. Growth. And to what end? Net revenue, donor pipeline, I want more of my relationship, I want them to know me more, they'll care more about me. Validation of my art, I want butts in the seat because the art is good, it is the conversation that matters. It's about mission. So I'm not really looking at earned revenue as a net revenue generator, I'm looking at it as a way to get people in the door. And the smallest organizations need to size your investment to define goals. And larger organizations need to think about investment differently as they move down. Fundraising, as you probably already guessed, is going to have some of the same metrics. Not surprisingly, the last 2 rounds of research showed us, and this is not surprising except when you actually see it in the data, the number one indicator of whether or not you are an individual, you are able to get individual gifts is average board gift. Everybody tells you that, right? Every fundraising consultant you ever hired told you that. Well, actually, they were right. Who knew? The number one indicator of whether or not you can raise individual funds is average size board gift. And it actually defines how big your donors will be, because people will not give outside the range of what your board will give. You might get 1, but you won't get 50. It's a huge indicator. And at the lower end, the return on fundraising is even more tricky than the return on earned revenue. If you hire an individual donor person, they better be able to figure out how to get those gifts out the door. If you're spending more than 50 cents on the dollar, a donor's not going to be happy. So they at least have to get 100% of their salary back. 200% of their salary back. So you can see at the low end, stepping into the individual market where we did this intellectual exercise where we said if you staffed right, because these folks did not staff right, what would be your efficiency? People would be upside down based on what is the potential. So that means you really have to understand if you're on the smaller end, are you about the kind of board gifts that you're getting right now, the kind of donor gifts you're getting right now, and is the number one thing that is supporting you, foundations. And if that is true, what does that mean for your ability to change it? You have to think long and hard about that. And you have to think long and hard if you're on the smaller end of the spectrum, if a major gift officer is actually beneficial. Grant writer, yes. In our practice, what we have seen is that managing directors and executive directors do a better job of individual gifts at a more cost-effective rate than a gift officer. Gift officer doesn't have any networks. The networks that matter are the networks that connect people to the art. And you care about the art. Those are the only networks that matter. So, again, this is about scale. So, same idea. You have to understand what are we chasing. Major donors that can provide net income. Some people are chasing broad-based giving as a sign of community support. That's a great goal. That's a really great goal. That is not going to grow you. That could sustain you. That is about how you are in the community. That's a fabulous goal. But that's really what matters. The other thing we found is, networks matter, as we said. That's true for larger organizations. Lots of people go out and hire a major gift officer saying they're going to bring their networks there. That's not true either. Before you hire a major gifts officer, what we found is the money comes first, starts to grow through your networks, and then a major gifts officer comes in and perfects it for you. So you have to really think about that. Okay, so if you're thinking about your business model being broken, you have to have an honest conversation and step back and look at your mission and vision. Look at the art you're trying to do. Understand this idea of scale and have an honest discussion of the net revenue available. Because then you can figure out, are you just adjusting your current business model? More focused choices of programming, reconfiguration of your organization model. Are you changing the core model? To use the words from this morning, are you in the moment of adaptive change? Is it something different? You can't conduct business in the same way. You have to think about new ways to offer your art and a new way to do your model. People do this. There are people in this room who have done this. I'm smiling at one of them. It is hard, but it is incredibly doable and it is incredibly liberating. Because living in the slosh consistently is depressing. Fixing it is hard, but incredibly liberating. So, who's the players? I used to have a fancy bunch of slides here that talked about the role of the stakeholders, the role of staff, the role of funders, the role of the board, senior leadership. I backed all that up after all this time, and really, this is a board issue. This is about the core of the organization. No money, no mission. Culture equals cash. All those things are true. You have to have the board level have an honest discussion about it. Is our mission and vision compelling? Are we relevant? Can we attract the dollars? Are we putting the art on the street that we have committed to? You have to get the board involved. It's everything about strategy and core mission. And so if the board doesn't buy it, no one else is going to buy it. It's all about the board. Number one, if you go home and say, this is something we really want to talk about, it has to happen at the board level. And to Kathy's point this morning, it is a generative issue that needs to be talked about with the whole board. It can't be the two guys from finance walking in and saying, I have no cash. Because people will go, what they said last year. It has to have the whole buy-in. So, those are the players. So, what is our summary? Know where you stand. Be honest about what category you're in. Know the difference between having a capital problem and a business model problem. Diagnose the right challenge. Understand your market. Think long and hard about risk. Raise the right capital first. Don't confuse growth with success. Do an honest appraisal of net revenue. And don't divorce capital from mission, vision, and strategy because it is indeed a board issue. And I'll end it right there. Any questions? Questions? Stunned silence. Yes.
If we might think of ourselves as broken, where would you start? Because that, I mean, it sounds great, but then you went back and said, okay, day one, what would you do?
All right. So first of all, so the question that you asked is day one. If you think you're broken day one, what would you do? Right. So number one thing that I agree with what Kathy said this morning, you have to have organizational agreement that you're broken. Number one thing you have to do is say we are indeed broken. And here's how we think we're broken. So you have to have some real honest conversation about that, and it has to happen probably first at the senior management or the team level. But then you got to go take it right to the board and get the board to agree. then you need to kind of step back and give yourself some space and some time to say, what is it that we really think is core to what we do? What is it? That's why I keep putting mission and vision out there. What is it that's at the core of what we do? And what is things we could do without? And if it's at the core of what we can do, how can we do it differently? Or is this the only way? And then what does that mean? If you can get that work done, that is the hardest work to do. The rest of it is, to use the term from this morning, technical. It's figuring out the size of the market, it's figuring out what the demand is, it's having honest conversations about what you can do and what you can't do. The hard part is agreeing we have a problem and agreeing to what's core. Having that conversation about really what's core and whether or not it's relevant in the marketplace, do people care? That's the hard part. That conversation is stuff I think we need a lot of space and time to have, but not too much space and time. If it goes on much more than a couple of months, you're just litigating. And you don't want to actually make decisions. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I don't want to stand up.
But just so
Hi, Linda Hartzell, Seattle Children's here. So to continue on with what Bob was saying, so if you look at this issue, scaling to the market, and you start to pay attention to the demographics of the audience, not just socioeconomic and cultural, but the ability to earn income and pay, meaning some of them are children. Yeah. When you really have to draw the line between what is pragmatic, what is practical, and what is moral, because I think a lot of us, in trying to do this work in different aspects of what all of it's producing, the discussion goes from being an arts organization to a social service organization, and it becomes a moral issue.
So I do work with social service
It's a
organizations.
bad business model, obviously.
I do work with social service organizations. They confront these same issues. Making choices actually allows you to do the core thing you want. Again, it goes back to what I said before. You have to understand what is exactly at the core and what is the most important thing, and figure out if you could concentrate on that. Who cares who buys? Could you make it better? As opposed to trying a bunch of things and kind of struggling at them all, it implies choice. It implies how do you figure out what is at the core of the moral decision that you're trying to make. And they are. I mean, social service organizations make these choices all the time. Yeah.
So the table with all the questions. On the state market with child's play. And so we try to understand our market in an economy where, it stabilized. Oh, well, no,
Yeah.
it didn't.
It didn't. Yeah.
And oh, it's going to be stabilized. Oh, well, no, it's not. And so it's like 5 years of drastic budget cuts to education. And for us, it's families, and families who are not seeing incomes rise for what is it, 6 years running now. And so we keep thinking we understand our market, and then we don't. And it's just, I feel like I'm in Hampshire with something.
I empathize and sympathize with that. I think, one of the things that we always say to people is if your market is rising, jump down. If your market is not, it's going to take twice as long as you can fix it. And so you should be thinking about the fact that the market will not rise. And that's,
We just want to stabilize.
I agree, but I think that's the piece that's hard. I mean, we always say to people, if you can see it going up and you can figure out how to work with that, that's great. If you can see where the opportunity of a new education program dollars coming from the federal government, you can see it's the beginning of the administration, then you jump. If it's bad right now, it's going to be bad for a while. It's going to be bad for a while. Yep.
Hi. Is it on?
Is it on? No.
My name is Francine Reynolds, and I'm from New Stage Theater, which is in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'm the artistic director. So what I'm going to say is something that I think is a problem. It's a brass, that's a bold question. And the managing director thinks it's a problem too. We're in a 50th anniversary campaign. Our 50th season is next season. And so this year, all of our 5-year pledges are going on the books.
Yeah.
And we're in the audit right now. The accountants want all of the pledges on the books right now. For me, I don't like it because I think I have all of that. And is that a problem?
Yeah. So let me just say, my 2-minute rant about auditors, if anybody's an auditor, I'm sorry, but not really. They work for you. They work for you. You want to reserve against those and then release the reserves because you feel uncomfortable, make them do it. They work for you. There are things within FASB that you can actually do. You can fix things like that. You need to have an honest conversation with your auditors to say, what is the financial reality? Audits are supposed to tell the real financial picture of an organization so that investors can make choices. Period. So if you're saying, I don't think this is my actual reality, I would like you to reserve against it, I want to show something different, or I believe these are temporarily restricted because of the way we did it, then you go in there and tell them. Stop my rant. Go ahead.
My name is Mark Valdez, and I've been networking on some years. And I have a question. We sort of struggled with the business model part versus, say, a financial model. I think it's a subtle distinction because I think that the business model is like, our business model, like we're subsidized. So that who cares, who pays? The people who pay are not necessarily the people who we're trying to reach. They're just the people who care, who are subsidizing the people that we're trying to reach. So you kind of have two constituents. So I think there's like a model under which we work. Like I think that we raise money to subsidize our offerings to people who kind of pay for part of it. And then there's the financial model, which is these are the things we have to do to make that pay. And so it's I don't know if this makes any sense.
Yeah. So
what I'm trying to figure out is those are two parts of the equation, and looking at how we move through that spectrum. We didn't quite talk enough about that distinction because we're trying to serve a constituent that isn't the constituent. Like our mission is not the people who are paying.
Yep. So this is the nonprofit triangle in business model. This is the organization and what they're trying to do. This is the payer, and there are many. They may have different values. And this is the goer or user, and they have different values. So lucky you get to try to balance what the public or your publics or your target audience want and need with what payers want and need, and they often don't align. So you get to try to figure it out, and hopefully you do it without lying too much. So, because mostly, I don't know, when I was a CFO, I lied. So, here's the honest to God conversation. Payers pay when you have impact. When no one, I'm going to say something that's really horrible. When no one cares about the people you care about, you have a business model failure. That's the conversation you've got to have. When you are working with populations that people care about and you're doing quality work, every bit of our research shows higher impact, higher payer. Higher impact, higher payer. Full houses bring more donors than half houses. Huge education programs serving tons of people bring in more donor dollars than boutique programs serving 100. It's inescapable in the data. This is the number. When I hire everybody out, I hire MBAs out of fancy graduate schools. They all want to grow gross income, and I'm like, no. You got to go do this. You got to figure out the relationship between goer, user, and payer. And then you have to figure out where that sits with an organization's mission. This is kind of nonprofit structural business model stuff.
Hello? Yeah. So it's interesting because, okay, so this morning we talked about board and governance, and mission was the goal, or was the aim. And now listening to this conversation, I find it is the conversation that I am constantly in with board members. Board members know this model. So they decide, okay, so we've identified the problem, and the problem is that we're here, we're selling at 30% or 60%. But to make a long story short, the result is always to cut programming and staffing. If your mission is the program, and your staff you have to execute the program. I'm sorry, it feels like a mind fuck. I'm sorry, this fuck is not feeling good. If we fucking it is good, I'm okay. If we fucking it is bad, I'm gonna stop. Just saying. So I'd like to know how to make this work.
So here's, so I agree, boards have the wrong conversation about this. What you often should be talking about is what is getting in the way of it being, what is getting in the way of us not having 60 or 80% audience? What is getting in the way? Is it price, could it be, I work in organizations like this, could it be that my price point is way too high? I need to drop my price point, but if I get to 80%, 100%, and I'm getting real impact, my donor base goes up and compensates. You got to change the conversation. Because this is the balance between, if you can get these numbers up, so I'm working with a group who's realized that they can have huge educational impact with schools for a very specific reason. It's here. And they know what they can do. What's standing between them and the ability to do it? School bus money. Okay, so they went to a donor and said, I can take it from 150 kids to 10,000 kids in 2 years if you give me $1 million. This program was about to cut. The donor went, what? Really, 10,000? She said, okay, I'll give you 500 to start, and if you get progress to 5K, I'll give you the rest. They changed the conversation. They didn't say, I can't get the kids here. My program is great. They said, what stands in the way of getting the kids here because the teachers want it, the educational system wants it. I can have impact. I can demonstrate it. What's my barrier? And they changed the equation from PTO money to a donor money. That changed the conversation. Yep. Anything else? And now I'm done. Because if Definia tells me I'm done, I'm done.
That's what we always say. If Phoenix tells you you're done, you're done. Okay, thanks, Susan. I'm actually thrilled to say that Susan's going to rejoin us tomorrow when we talk about field conditions. So if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, keep it in your back pocket for tomorrow. Now, in the words of some of my favorite stage managers, we're going to take a short 15-minute break.